My name is Jacqueline Bhabha, and I'm the Director of Research at the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. I'm going to talk about a report that our center is about to release, an important report which deals with the failure of current Indian practice in relation to the rescue and reintegration of children who've been trafficked. The report originates from a trip that I made with colleagues about 2 years ago, where we went and looked at the procedures for dealing with children, in this case boys, who'd been trafficked across India for labor exploitation. Normally when people talk about trafficking, they're thinking of girls and of sex trafficking, but actually labor trafficking is at least as prevalent. And so our report looks at what the Indian government does when children are identified as having been trafficked for exploitation, what they do to reintegrate them and to help them. The report is important because despite the amount of attention to the issue of trafficking, there's very little systematic work documenting the impact of follow-up, documenting the impact of attempts to remedy the problem. And so our report really inserts itself into something that's more or less a data-free zone, looking at the impact of current policies. And our interviews produced a lot of data which really, in essence, showed a dramatic inconsistency between the policy commitments that the Indian government has entered into and on-the-ground realities. The starting point really is that the Indian government has made a lot of effort to do something about child labor and child trafficking. We have all read stories and seen photographs of children who are desperately exploited, either in brick kilns or in carpet factories or in sweatshops producing beedis, those little cigarettes that people smoke in India, or glass factories. So the problem is certainly not unknown, and the Indian government has issued a large number of laws and protocols and standard operating procedures to guide officials working in this area. The trouble is that there are many different departments involved, many different regulations, and coordination across the departments, across the institutions working in the area, and across the very large geographical spans which are involved in the process is very poor. And so the net result is that many of the good intentions of the frameworks are not actually realized in the elements that are in place on the ground in practice. Well, the rescue process is a fraught one. Typically, raids are carried out often in response to information that has been either sent to the authorities or gleaned in some other way. And so a group of people, typically labor department officials, sometimes police, sometimes NGOs, sometimes child welfare workers, raid a particular factory or a particular sweatshop in order to rescue the children. But what we found, and what the people we interviewed told us, was that there are dramatic failures in integration of the various systems that are required, that the raids are poorly planned, that they often have different agencies involved with poor coordination between them. And the net result is actually really negative for the children. So in practice, we found that very often the children are very frightened, that there's a feeling of chaos, and often children themselves feel as if they are targets of criticism rather than really, seen as persons, children who've survived horrendous circumstances. What's more, the quality of the immediate post-rescue care is also inconsistent. So many children who've been, working 18 hours a day, say in a jewelry sweatshop making glass bangles, or who are working in a brick kiln, or who are working rolling these little tobacco cigarettes, They have medical issues, they have issues of trauma, they have stunting in their growth, they have many serious consequences from the exploitation which need attention, both physical, medical attention, but also counseling, support, advice, mentorship. And the interviews that we did suggest that there's very little of that in the post-rescue context. Children are sometimes taken to police stations, sometimes they're taken to children's homes, but the sort of attention they get is pretty perfunctory and cursory. Another problem we found is the legal aspect of the intervention is deficient. People intervening and rescuing children from situations of trafficking are supposed to file so-called first information reports, or FIRs, with the police in order to initiate criminal proceedings. The idea being that you want to deter the traffickers or the exploiters from these practices. But we found that these FIRs are very sporadically filed, and that the people who are exploiting the children are rarely prosecuted. Perhaps even worse is the situation with respect to reintegration. We found a lot of problems in the reintegration process, including the fact that key stakeholders, key operatives in this process really didn't know what the reintegration requirements were. They didn't have any support in instituting systems that could really help the children and help the children's families with a medium and long-term process of change. And in fact, the general rule is that reintegration is treated as a short-term process, basically, of returning the child to his or her, and a case we looked at were boys, so to his family, and leaving him there and assuming that being in the family environment will look after itself. And the whole point of a reintegration process is to ease children who've been out of school, who've been working and who've been exploited, to ease them back into a productive educational system. But we found again that educational programs, insofar as they work in isolation, and that there's very little linking of children who've maybe never been in school to a process that enables them to then reintegrate into the normal formal classroom. So the opportunity for dedicated services to facilitate learning and to facilitate integration, to support families who need help in setting up and maintaining these systems, these sorts of facilities we found were really not available. And as a result, children who had not been able to access school rarely were able to access school again after their experience in the trafficking network. Even after the initial raid, the ongoing health needs of children in the resettlement context back home, if you like, were not really well attended to. The psychological needs of the children were often an afterthought at best, and we did not find, our informants told us, of no concrete initiatives to really secure sustainable health and psychological services for these children, which is a very serious deficit in the programming. Or what is needed is a more systematic and better integrated system of organizational accountability. What the problem that we found is really a lack of accountability, a lack of coordination between the different agencies, a lack of training, a lack of support for those who are working in both the raid context where the children are initially found and in the home context to which the children are returned. So what's really needed, and I think what we hope our report will encourage, is some rethinking about how funding is allocated, how services are allocated, and how organizations work together to strengthen the support that these very vulnerable communities need. Amongst the particular recommendations we make is a focus on the need to really prioritize child welfare, child protection and human rights in the approaches that these agencies use, so that when the Labour Department goes in to raid a factory, for example, they need to really look at the child welfare approaches that are relevant in that context. They need to work closely with NGOs or non-profit organizations who are supported by the government to ensure that the information about the children is available in the correct places, and that the policies that apply are really instituted correctly and in an ongoing and systematic way. We end our report with a whole series of recommendations, the conclusion of which really is that if the current agencies working on child trafficking and child exploitation could be supported to work together to have standard operating procedures which clearly delineate responsibility, which clearly delineate which agency does what, and which train people in the organizations to provide ongoing care, ongoing encouragement and ongoing support to families, then the chances that children won't be re-trafficked within 3 months of being returned home will increase and improve significantly. So we hope that our report contributes to an integrated child rights rethink of current rescue and reintegration of children who've been exploited and trafficked for the benefit of this particularly vulnerable population of children.